So this was just, it's sometimes, you can get facts and figures, but sometimes looking at a graph just visually helps you understand something better. So he tweeted this and he said, I'll just read it out. He says, "What the hell is wrong with people? The capacity to think seems to have evaporated." And then this is a graph of the daily new deaths in New York. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see this is starting in March, like around March 12th, and ending on December 3rd. And for anyone who's not looking, you can see there was a high spike around about April and May.
April. Yep.
It started falling off in May. And remember when they were saying flatten the curve? So the curve in terms of daily death count was flattened, like right around May. And then you have this very, very small, almost invisible bar graph line from about May until where we're at in December. There's a tiny little uptick in December, tiny.
Yep.
And that's where we're at. But because of it just helped me to visually remember what it was like when they kept saying 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Remember that?
Oh.
And now it's indefinite.
Yeah.
Why?
Well,
What's
this
the
is
justification?
this is a great segue, Carrie, because I want to talk about. Man, this is pissing me off. Sorry. Sometimes it's like my emotions get too much that I can't. I'm so angry that I can't speak. Okay, so I want to talk about testing. Keith, the hat guy, I think it was Keith. So I'm sorry if it was someone else. I think it was Keith. Shared a COVID testing article, which I found quite fascinating. And we have to get like slightly sciencey, but it's worth it. Trust me that it's worth it to understand what's going on. So here's the article. Why mass PCR testing of the healthy and asymptomatic is currently counterproductive. Now, we should probably take a moment. Maybe I should just take a moment quickly and explain PCR testing. So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. By the way, I am not a biologist or chemist person, but I was an electrical engineer, and I suspect that we might have some computer science / electrical engineer people in our audience based on some discussions I've seen. So I'm going to give an analogy. A PCR test is kind of like a photomultiplier tube, for those of you who know what a photomultiplier tube is. But the way it works, so the virus has RNA. So generally the rule is like DNA produces RNA, RNA produces proteins, proteins produce us. Like that's the kind of biology 101, right? And so the virus there's like viral RNA, and you can have RNA from the virus in your body because you are over it. It could be totally like mostly gone. Like it'll last and kind of die slowly in your system. So you can have RNA lying around and not at all have an infection. Not at all, right? You could be, in fact, what they can try and do is try and incubate the virus from your RNA or from your thing. And if they can't, then you don't even have it, right? So, but you can, you might have exposure, or you might have past been exposed and getting over it or whatever. So what a PCR does is they take that RNA and they put in an enzyme in, this is very elementary version of my explanation, but they put an enzyme in this bath with the RNA. They take your sample. So your sample supposedly has the RNA in it if they're testing you, your, snot or whatever the hell they're testing, right? And they put an enzyme in it. And this enzyme basically takes, if the COVID RNA is there, it creates DNA out of that COVID RNA with something called fluorescence on it. So it'll fluoresce, it'll emit radiation, very low level of radiation. And so it binds to any RNA that's there. It kind of produces this DNA. And then the PCR process basically takes the two strands of DNA. They put it through a process that basically separates the DNA strands. They put some more, they put a different enzyme, I guess, in, or whatever it is, polymerase, I guess they put that in, and it then duplicates that. So instead of, you start with one strand and you get 2 strands, right? And then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And so each time they do that is called a cycle. And so what they do with the PCRs, to detect this level of sensitivity, you need to know kind of how many cycles they went through on this PCR. And what they do is they do that a whole bunch of times, and then they see if they can detect any fluorescence from the sample. And if they can, then it turns out that there was some RNA in there, and it got turned into DNA, replicated a whole bunch of times, and that was present. And if they can't, it was absent. That's kind of how they think about it. But
okay,
so we're going to go through this and just have this in mind that every time you do another cycle, you're getting more and more sensitive detection of RNA. So theoretically, if you did infinite cycles, you would basically always get a positive, always in quotes, maybe like one tiny RNA strand was present that's dead, and you would still get a positive result. Like that's kind of the mathematical theory of it, is like you'd eventually pick it up. So let's look at this article really quickly. So why testing the healthy and asymptomatic is currently counterproductive. So this article mentions that the CDC recently changed their testing guidance. And it says if you do not have COVID-19 symptoms and have not been in close contact with someone known to have COVID-19 infection, you do not need a test. A negative test does not mean you will not contract an infection at a later time. If you decide to be tested, you should self-isolate, blah, 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 blah. Now, this is good that they're saying you shouldn't test unless you have symptoms. And the reason that's good is you can get positives just randomly. You can get the population, you just get positives if you don't have any infections. So you don't want people out there testing, diverting resources and time and energy away from people who are actually sick. But the main point here is what's still true about CDC's website, and I double checked this. These are the CDC testing guidelines. All right. The CDC testing guidelines says you look for this fluorescence after within 40 cycles. So that means you do this PCR cycle thing I was talking about 40 times. And if you detect fluorescence after 40 times or before 40 times, then it's a positive. Okay?
Okay.
Now, a couple people have studied this. A few different people have studied this. It turns out, I'll just read some of these. There's a Canadian study that found that the live virus was only detected when the cycle threshold was less than 24. Now, when I say the live virus is detected, they take it and they try to actually cultivate the virus. It means according to the Canadian study, if you're getting a positive test, but it takes 25 cycles, it's actually not a valid positive test. You don't actually have the virus. You're not infected. You tested positive, but you're not infected. There might be like a dead strand that's getting picked up, right? But you're not infected. So according
to that dead strand mean? That means that you did maybe have it at some point?
It might mean you had it. It might mean you were exposed to it and like just, it didn't take. I don't know. I'm not a biologist, but I do know that it means they're unable to cultivate the virus. You don't have an infection. And the reason that I want to point this out is the mainstream media is conflating the word infection with positive test results. And that's a huge problem, as you'll see in a minute. Okay. So this Canadian study says, look, you don't actually have an infection unless you detected it in less than 24 cycles. Otherwise, it's just a positive that doesn't mean anything. Another study, a French study on the duration of infections, they cultured samples from PCR tests. So again, they took these samples that you were being tested and they tried to grow the virus. They gave it an optimal environment and said like, hey, can we tease out? Can we give the sample COVID? Right? And they produced this graph. And what you can see from this graph is basically their number is 34, but after 34 cycles, no one actually had the virus. And according to them, and this is a recent New York Times article talked about this as well, specimens detected in the 24 to 34 cycles rarely show any live virus. So basically, if you're way up in that high end, it's taken a lot of cycles to find it, you're probably fine. You're probably fine. Now, let's get back to what we just said a moment ago. The CDC is using the 40 cycle threshold. Now, if you do some really simple math and you just say, so it turns out that every cycle degrades it degrades by 33%. So the likelihood that you have your likelihood to actually cultivate a virus degrades by 33% for every cycle. So if you just do the simple math between 34 cycles, which is the upper limit of this French test, the French study, if you just do the math between 34 cycles and 40 cycles, which is the CDC number, what you find out is that you're getting 90% false positive rates at that end, right? And they spell it out for you here in this article. A literature review of studies on infectiousness based on PCR testing found 2 studies showing that the odds of live virus culture reduced by 33% for every 1 unit, blah, blah, blah. The bottom line is that 70 to 90% of positive results from COVID-19 PCR tests are currently inaccurate because they detect viruses at levels that are either too small to transmit to others or simply a remnant of recent exposure. So, what makes this even more interesting? Here is a graph that they did. The blue line is test results, reported cases. Now, they're calling it a case and an infection if you have a positive test. But of course, as we just saw, a positive test doesn't mean you have an infection. But that's what they're using. And if you'll notice, and the orange line is deaths. Okay, so the deaths were at a peak, back here in April, mid-April. Towards the end of April. It's hard. I know this is probably hard to read. There we go. Positive tests upturn here on June 9th. So notice what they've done. What they did was they started to test people that didn't have other symptoms. And what that does is just obviously increase the likelihood, because their test is so hypersensitive, it just increases the likelihood that they're getting false positives. So what you see here, though, is these things, the death rates and the infection rate, the quote infection rates, positive test rates, diverge. You're having way more positive tests. At the beginning, they were together, and now they've massively diverged. And this goes through beginning of September. So I don't know how old this article is, but a couple months. So you've got lots of cases, but actually not a lot of deaths to correspond to those cases. And this is why, you can see it again here in this graph. Cases is the blue stuff in the background. And this is the 7-day average of death, this orange. This is why this is why they've switched to talking about cases instead of deaths. And what they're doing is they are using these cases. They've got a hypersensitive test. So they were doing 2 things previously. A, they had a hypersensitive test, and B, they just started testing people randomly, like almost randomly. Like you don't have any known contact with anyone with COVID. You don't have any COVID symptoms. We're going to test you, and then we're going to test you with a hypersensitive test that's likely to provide a positive result. And then we're going to use that information to justify mass hysteria and lockdowns. And yeah, it is good that the CDC recently said, well, the guidelines are you don't have to test unless you have symptoms now. They've changed that. But they're still using this hypersensitive test. And a lot of states and a lot of counties are ignoring the CDC guidelines, and they're doing massive testing anyway. So you're getting all of this testing with hypersensitive tests, and that's then therefore being used to justify these lockdowns when there isn't really a justification for these lockdowns.
Does the article kind of go into that and make it plain for people? Because I think part of the problem would be just explaining everything that you just did.
I tried to make it plainer than the article. So
okay. Yeah.
Maybe it needs to be made plainer than that. But I guess the summary is the tests are hypersensitive. There's a very high false positive rate. And so talking and infection and positive tests are not the same thing. So you'll hear mainstream media say, in fact, we just looked at this. Actually, I don't know. I don't think I have it anymore, but you sent, here it is. Oh, these are daily deaths. But if you look at infection rates, they'll say, oh, here are the infection rates for this area. Those aren't infection rates. Those are positive test rates. Positive tests are not infections.
Wow.
But they have conflated the two. And so they've convinced everyone that there's massive infection rate when that's not true. There's a massive positive testing increase, not a massive infection increase. In fact, here, well, let's look at another piece of data for fun. Here is kind of a fun site, Our World in Data. This is kind of hard to see, but we'll try and see it anyway, because both the linear and the logarithmic graph are kind of not clear, but we'll walk through them. The orange is daily confirmed cases. And this is in the world, by the way. And the bottom here is deaths, daily confirmed deaths. Now you would look, it looks like there's a massive amount of increases in daily confirmed cases. And again, cases in quote, cases is being measured by positive tests. But the deaths have not correspondingly risen as much. Now there has been a rise in death, but it hasn't corresponded to the rise in the number of cases. And you can switch to the log chart, because this death is hard to see. You can switch to the logarithmic chart. Now a logarithmic chart is tough because each line here, logarithmic means you're seeing an order of magnitude jump between each line here. So it makes it look like they're tracking a lot closer than they are. But again, this one's death, this bluish gray, and this orange is confirmed cases. But you can just do some quick math. If you look back here and you do some math, you see that the confirmed cases, the deaths to confirmed cases ratio is like 7% or somewhere around there at the beginning. And it's dropped to less than 2% over here. So they've diverged. And the reason they've diverged is precisely because we have started to we're testing more people and we're relying on hypersensitive tests. And they're using that again. So you can also see, I was looking for counter evidence. And I ran across this COVID tracking project at The Atlantic. And I was like, wow, the COVID tracking project, that paper we looked at before, their data went to about here, mid-September. And you can see after mid-September, according to the COVID tracking project, wow, the deaths have skyrocketed. Where are they getting that data? Well, it turns out if you ask them where they're getting that data, always a problem, they're getting it from press conferences and what state health officials are saying. So this isn't great data. You really should be going to maybe the CDC or the excess mortality rates here. Again, you're not seeing you're seeing a small uptick in death, but not a huge one, right? Back in April was the big one. There's not another, I mean, it's gone up in the last week or so, according to the CDC. Here, let's look at the CDC. Here's the CDC, right? April's the peak. We're nowhere near the peak. This is the CDC. I mean, if you're going to use numbers and scare people, I don't know why you're using press conference numbers. Why aren't you using the CDC numbers? But if you use press conference numbers, you can make scary graphs like this that make it look like the death rate is going up. Crazy.
Press conference numbers.
Yeah, my favorite thing is press conference numbers. So
that's like that makes about as much sense as saying that we're going to let the New York Times decide who won the presidential election.
Well, no one would.
They get to announce.
That's crazy.